My name is Charles Thompson. I was born in the south side of Chicago, Illinois, in 1963. Today, at 62 years old, with trembling hands and tired eyes, I sit down to write what I have kept silent for decades out of shame, pain, and a mixture of rage and sadness that still burns in my chest. This is the story of how my parents, Margaret Elaine and Robert Thompson, lost everything waiting for the end of the world that never came. It's the story of how an entire family was destroyed by a lying prophecy, and how I, my sister Hope, and my two younger siblings, Matthew and Lucy, grew up among the ruins of that betrayed hope. My parents had converted to Jehovah's Witnesses in 1968, when I was barely 5 years old. I vividly remember the day when two well-dressed women, Martha and Helen Johnson, knocked on the door of our small apartment on 47th Street. My mother, a woman with a noble heart who always sought answers to the questions life posed to her, received them with the typical hospitality of our neighborhood. Those women spoke with a certainty that my mother had never heard before. They had answers for everything. Why there was suffering, why good people died young, why the world seemed to be getting crueler every day. My father, Robert, was a hard-working man who worked as a mechanic at Miller's Auto Shop on the west side. He earned just enough to support us, but we were happy. On Sundays we went to Grant Park. My mother cooked pot roast that filled the entire building with its aroma, and in the evenings my father told me stories while fixing some appliance at the kitchen table. We were an ordinary family from 1960s Chicago, with ordinary dreams. That the children would study, that we could have our own little house someday, that old age would find us peaceful and surrounded by grandchildren. But all that changed when my parents began studying the Bible with Jehovah's Witnesses. At first, the changes were subtle. My mother stopped putting up Christmas decorations. My father no longer took us to Cubs games on Sundays because they had to attend meetings at the Kingdom Hall. Little by little, our house filled with Watchtower and Awake magazines, and our family conversations increasingly revolved around Bible verses and the teachings of Jehovah's organization. I remember that my sister Hope, who was 8 then, once asked why we could no longer celebrate her birthday. My mother, with tears in her eyes but with a firmness I had never known in her, explained that Jehovah did not approve of those pagan celebrations. Hope cried that night, hidden in our shared bedroom, and I, without fully understanding what was happening, comforted her as best I could. In 1970, when rumors about 1975 began circulating more strongly, my parents were already completely immersed in the congregation. My father had been appointed as a ministerial servant and my mother was a regular pioneer, dedicating more than 90 hours monthly to door-to-door preaching. It was as if they had found not just a religion, but a completely new identity. But it was in 1972 when everything precipitated toward the abyss. I remember perfectly the day my father came home from work with an expression I had never seen before. It was a mixture of ecstasy and terror, as if he had seen something supernatural. He sat at the kitchen table, took my mother's hands and told her with a trembling voice, "Elaine, sister, the time has been shortened. The most mature brothers in the congregation are certain that Armageddon will come in October 1975. We have less than 3 years to prepare." My mother paled, but then smiled with that smile she had learned to use when talking about spiritual matters. "If Jehovah has so arranged it, Robert, we will be ready." That night, after sending us to bed, I heard them talk until very late. Their voices came muffled to our room, but I could catch fragments of a conversation that would change our lives forever. "We can't be selfish, Elaine. If we only have 3 years left, every minute counts. The children need to know the truth. There's no time for worldly plans." From that moment on, our house became an operations center for the end of the world. My father began declining overtime at the auto shop. "Why accumulate riches if soon money won't exist?" he told my mother when she worried about pending bills. He stopped saving for the little house they had been planning. Moreover, he began talking about selling the apartment we lived in, which they had bought with so much effort years before. My mother abandoned the small sewing business she had at home. The neighborhood ladies no longer came looking for her to have dresses altered or curtains made. "My time now belongs to Jehovah," she explained when some client insisted. The few extra dollars that work brought to the family vanished overnight. But the most painful thing to witness was how my parents began to change their relationship with us, their children. My brother Matthew, who was brilliant at mathematics, had always dreamed of being an engineer. He was barely 12 years old, but already showed exceptional ability to solve problems and build things with his hands. My father, who before had been proud of Matthew's good grades and encouraged him to study, began telling him that it made no sense to waste time on the wisdom of this condemned world. In the new system, son, Jehovah will teach you everything you need to know. Why are you going to study engineering if in 3 years universities won't exist? Matthew resisted at first. I remember seeing him cry silently while doing homework, knowing that our parents considered every minute dedicated to secular studies as time stolen from Jehovah. Little by little, his grades began to decline. Not because he was less intelligent, but because at home there was no longer support, no incentive, no future to prepare for. My sister Hope, who had always been extroverted and sociable, was isolating herself from her school classmates. She could no longer participate in school festivals, couldn't go to birthday parties, couldn't talk about the topics that interested girls her age because the world and its diversions had been declared enemies in our home. I saw her become taciturn, responding with monosyllables when I asked her how her day at school had been. Lucy, the youngest, who was barely 6 years old, absorbed everything like a sponge. She began repeating phrases she had heard at meetings. The children in my school are going to die in Armageddon because they don't know Jehovah. I heard her say this to a little neighbor girl with the same naturalness with which she might have commented on the weather. The girl's mother complained to my mother, and there was a terrible argument in which my mother defended Lucy's words, saying it was Christian courage to speak the truth regardless of consequences. As for me, who was then 9 years old, I began developing a constant fear that accompanied me day and night. My parents constantly talked about the signs of the end: earthquakes, wars, food shortages. Every news story in the Chicago Tribune became confirmation that Armageddon was near. I developed a pathological anxiety toward any loud sound, any ambulance siren, any plane that passed over our house. Was this the moment? Had the end already arrived? But my parents seemed happy. It was as if they had found the ultimate meaning of their lives. They woke up each morning with an energy I had never seen in them before, sure they were doing the right thing, convinced that soon they would live forever in an earthly paradise alongside all of Jehovah's faithful servants. In 1973, a year and a half before the supposed Armageddon, my father made the most destructive decision of his life. He sold our apartment. I remember the day he came home with the cash money. It was more money than we had ever seen gathered in one place. He put it on the kitchen table and gathered us all together. "My children," he said solemnly, "this money will sustain us until Armageddon comes. We no longer need to worry about mortgages or monthly payments. Now we can dedicate all our time to preaching." My mother cried with happiness. "Jehovah has blessed us, Robert. Now we can be truly free to serve him." We moved to a small rented apartment in Englewood, cheaper and more precarious than the one we had left. But my parents didn't see the leaking ceiling or the dampness in the walls. They only saw freedom. Freedom from material worries, freedom to dedicate themselves completely to preaching work, freedom to wait for the end of the world without distractions. The money from selling the apartment was consumed faster than my parents had calculated. Not because they were irresponsible with spending, but because they had underestimated how much it cost to maintain a family of 6 without regular income. My father had reduced his work hours to the bare minimum. My mother no longer did sewing. Their only source of income was the few hours my father worked at the shop, and that only when Mr. Miller needed him. By 1974, our family's economic outlook was bleak, but religious fervor had intensified. The meetings at the Kingdom Hall were more frequent and more emotional. The congregation elders spoke with an urgency that could be felt in the air. "We only have a few months left, brothers. Every day counts. Every hour counts. Are you doing everything you can for the kingdom work?" My father began preaching in the streets, holding a sign that said, "The end of the world is near. Are you prepared?" Other brothers from the congregation accompanied him, and together they walked through the streets of downtown Chicago shouting warnings about the imminent Armageddon. People looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Some stopped to listen, but most continued on their way, shaking their heads. My mother, meanwhile, had increased her door-to-door preaching hours. She left early in the morning and returned at dusk, exhausted but satisfied, counting the magazines she had managed to place and the return visits she had obtained. Her hands, which had once been soft from the delicate work of sewing, had become rough from so much walking in the Chicago sun and knocking on doors. We, the children, lived in a strange limbo. At school, our classmates talked about plans for summer vacation, about what they wanted to be when they grew up, about the TV shows they hoped to watch. We couldn't participate in those conversations because we knew that by December 1975 there would be no more summer vacations, no television, no schools. Only Jehovah's paradise. Matthew, who was then 14, had completely stopped studying. His teachers called home several times to talk to my parents about his performance, but they always responded the same way: "Our son is receiving the most important education, spiritual education. The rest has no eternal value." Hope, meanwhile, had become extremely religious. She spent hours reading the Bible and Watchtower publications, memorizing verses and repeating phrases she heard at meetings. She had completely lost interest in typical teenage things. She didn't talk about boys, didn't worry about clothes or hairstyles, had no friends outside the congregation. It was as if she had decided it wasn't worth investing emotional energy in anything temporary. Lucy, the youngest, lived in a state of constant confusion. At school they talked to her about a future, about jobs she could have when she grew up, about college careers, about starting a family. At home they talked to her about a completely different future, about living forever in a perfect garden where lions would eat grass and she could play with tame tigers. She didn't know which of the two versions to believe, and that uncertainty manifested in nightmares and anxiety that was too sophisticated for a child her age. As for me, I had developed a kind of double life. During the day, at school, I tried to be a normal kid. I played basketball during recess, did my homework, laughed at my classmates' jokes. But at home, I transformed into the son of the end of the world. I participated in family prayers, listened silently to conversations about Armageddon, pretended to share my parents' excitement about the proximity of paradise. But at night, lying in my bed, I was assaulted by questions I couldn't ask anyone. What if my parents were wrong? What if 1975 came and went without anything happening? What would become of us then? How would we live without the apartment we had sold, without savings, without plans for the future? These questions terrified me because they implied doubting my parents, and doubting my parents meant doubting Jehovah himself. In our home, there was no room for doubts. Doubts were inspirations from Satan to weaken our faith in crucial moments. As 1975 approached, the tension in our house became palpable. My parents had stopped making any plans that extended beyond October. They didn't buy new clothes because, why spend on vanities if soon we'll wear white robes in paradise? They didn't fix things that broke in the house because, anyway, soon we'll live in perfect houses that Jehovah will give us. The money from selling the apartment had been almost completely depleted. My father, who already worked very few hours per week, began having problems with Mr. Miller. "Robert," he told him, "either you commit to the work or I'm going to have to find another mechanic. I can't depend on someone who comes when he wants and leaves when he feels like it." My father, instead of reconsidering, interpreted this as religious persecution. "It's the pressure that Satan exerts on Jehovah's faithful servants," he explained to my mother. "The system is trying to distract us from what's important in these final months." So he quit his job. We arrived at 1975 practically without income, living on charity from some brothers in the congregation and the few dollars my mother occasionally earned cleaning houses, though she did this almost secretly because her time was supposed to be dedicated exclusively to preaching. The last months before October were surreal. My parents lived in a state of constant ecstasy, as if they were already touching the doors of paradise. They talked about what it would be like to wake up in the new world, about the animals they could pet, about the dead relatives they would see resurrected again. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Beautiful because of the genuine happiness they radiated, terrible because of the complete disconnection from reality that represented. In September 1975, my father made a decision that still keeps me awake at night. He sold the few pieces of furniture we had left. The dining room table where we had eaten breakfast for years, the beds where we had slept, my parents' dresser, everything went to a used furniture store. "We only need the essentials for these last weeks," he justified. "When paradise comes, Jehovah will give us everything we need." We slept on mattresses thrown on the floor. We ate sitting on the ground. The house, which was already precarious, became something like a refugee camp. But my parents smiled. They smiled with a serenity I couldn't understand. October arrived like all months do, with normal days, with common news, with people going to work and children going to school. My parents had calculated that Armageddon would begin around the 15th, coinciding with some significant dates from the Jewish calendar they had been studying. October 15, 1975 dawned with a soft, persistent rain, typical of Chicago autumn. My parents woke up earlier than usual and spent the morning in prayer. We didn't have breakfast because it was a day of fasting and spiritual meditation. We stayed home, waiting. We waited all morning. We waited all afternoon. We waited all night. Nothing happened. My mother stayed awake until 3 in the morning, looking out the window as if expecting to see angels descending from heaven. My father paced around the small apartment like a caged lion, checking dates on a calendar over and over again, rereading Bible verses, whispering prayers that sounded more like desperate pleas than acts of faith. "Maybe we were wrong about the day," my mother said when they finally went to sleep. "Maybe it's the 20th or the 25th. Dates can be confusing." But the 20th passed, and the 25th, and October 31st, and November, and December. There was no Armageddon. There was no end of the world. There was no earthly paradise. There was only silence. The heaviest silence I had ever heard in my life. A silence that settled in our house like an unwanted guest who was never going to leave. My parents didn't talk about the subject for days. It was as if something so terrible had happened that it had no name, something that couldn't be mentioned without completely crumbling the reality they had built for years. But practical reality didn't wait for their internal processes. Problems began to rain down like a relentless cascade. First came the debts. We owed 3 months' rent. The apartment landlord had been patient until October because my parents had explained that soon they wouldn't need the place, but when December arrived without apocalypse, his letters became threatening. We had 1 week to pay or they would throw us out on the street. We had no money. We had no furniture to sell. We had no relatives to turn to because my parents had distanced themselves from all family members who didn't share their religious beliefs. My father tried to get work, but almost 2 years had passed since he had quit the auto shop. Mr. Miller had already hired another mechanic. At other shops, when he explained why he had been out of work for so long, reactions ranged from laughter to disbelief. Who was going to hire a man who had left everything because he believed the world was going to end? My mother tried to resume her seamstress work, but her old clients had already found other people. Moreover, they had sold the sewing machine months earlier. She had no tools, no contacts, no recent references. The situation became desperate very quickly. In January 1976, 3 months after the Armageddon that never came, we were evicted from the apartment. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. 2 burly men arrived with the landlord and began taking our few belongings to the street. My parents didn't protest. It was as if they had lost the capacity to fight, as if all their energy had been exhausted in those years of intense waiting. We ended up living in the house of a sister from the congregation, Carmen Williams, an elderly widow who had compassion for our situation. It was a small house in the projects on the south side, with 2 bedrooms and a concrete backyard. We crammed into one of the bedrooms, all 6 of us, sleeping on mattresses we had gotten from congregation donations. But the most devastating thing wasn't the material poverty. It was my parents' spiritual collapse. My mother, who had been a strong and determined woman, fell into a deep depression. She stopped getting up early, stopped getting dressed, stopped smiling. She spent hours sitting on a plastic chair in the backyard, staring into space with an expression I could never decipher. Was it sadness? Was it shame? Was it anger? Maybe it was all of it together. My father, meanwhile, developed a bitterness that extended to everything around him. He no longer spoke of Jehovah with love, but with resentment. "They lied to me," he said when he thought we weren't listening. "The elders lied to me. The organization lied to me. I lost everything for a lie." But the cruelest thing was that they couldn't completely blame the organization, because that would mean admitting they had ruined their family through their own naivety. It was easier to blame themselves. Maybe they hadn't had enough faith, maybe they had misinterpreted the teachings, maybe they weren't worthy of paradise. This mental self-flagellation consumed them day and night. We, the children, became involuntary witnesses to our parents' disintegration. Matthew, who was then 16, had to completely leave school to work. He got a job at a factory, working 12-hour shifts for a miserable salary. He had become the family breadwinner overnight, carrying a responsibility that didn't correspond to his age. Hope, who was 14, became rebellious. All the extreme religiosity of previous years transformed into its opposite. She began going out with older boys, coming home late, talking back when my parents tried to discipline her. "Why should I obey them?" she told me once. "They were wrong about the most important thing. How can I trust them for anything else?" Lucy, who was 8, developed behavioral problems at school. She fought with other children, had inexplicable tantrums, wet her bed almost every night. Teachers called my parents several times to talk about her conduct, but they no longer had the energy to deal with these issues. It was as if they had exhausted all their capacity to be parents in those years of religious fanaticism. I, who was 12, became a kind of family mediator. I was the only one who still maintained some kind of communication with my parents, the only one who could comfort my siblings when they cried, the only one who tried to keep together a family that was falling apart day by day. But inside, I was also breaking. I had grown up believing my parents had all the answers, that they knew where the world was going, that they had a divine plan for our lives. Discovering they were as lost as anyone else, or more so, was devastating. It was like the ground had opened under my feet and I had nothing solid to stand on. Additionally, I had to deal with social shame. In the neighborhood, everyone knew what had happened to us. We were the crazy family that sold everything waiting for the end of the world. Neighbors looked at us with a mixture of pity and mockery. Kids my age teased me at school, imitating my father's preaching or asking me when the next end of the world was coming. In the congregation, the situation wasn't better. Many brothers had gone through similar experiences, though perhaps not as extreme as ours. There was an atmosphere of generalized disillusionment and confusion. The elders tried to explain what had happened by talking about adjustments in understanding and overly specific expectations, but their explanations sounded hollow after years of proclaiming with such certainty that 1975 would be the year of Armageddon. Some brothers left the congregation. Others, like my parents, stayed but with withered faith, like plants that had received too much sun and now couldn't recover their original greenness. My parents' health began deteriorating rapidly. My mother developed stomach ulcers that made her writhe in pain during the nights. My father began having heart problems, probably related to constant stress and depression. But they couldn't afford adequate medical treatment. When the pain became unbearable, we went to the county hospital, where we waited hours to receive basic care. During 1977 and 1978, we lived in absolute poverty. We ate once a day, and often that meal consisted of bread with powdered milk. Meat was a luxury we saw maybe once a month. My mother had learned to perform miracles with noodles, oatmeal, and the cheapest vegetables from the market. Matthew worked from dawn to dusk and came home exhausted, with hands dirty from grease and empty eyes. He was a teenager who had lost his adolescence, who had to become an adult before his time. He never complained, but I saw in his gaze a deep resentment toward my parents for having stolen his future. Hope had left home. One day she simply didn't return from school. We found her 3 days later at a friend's house whose mother had agreed to shelter her. When my father went to look for her, she refused to return. "I'd rather live anywhere than in that house of crazy people," she shouted in front of all the people who had gathered to watch the scandal. My father returned home walking like an old man, though he was barely 42 years old. That night I heard him cry for the first time in my life. It was a hoarse, desperate crying, like that of a wounded animal. My mother comforted him, but her words sounded empty even to herself. Lucy clung to me like a lifeline. We slept on the same mattress, and at night she whispered questions I didn't know how to answer. Why did Dad and Mom lie to us? Why are we poor? Are people from the government going to come get us? She had constant fear that they would separate us, that some social worker would decide my parents weren't capable of taking care of us. In 1979, 4 years after the Armageddon that never came, my father died. It wasn't a dramatic death. There were no heart attacks or accidents. He simply faded away like a candle running out of wax. For months he had been increasingly weak, thinner, more absent. The doctors at the county hospital said he had multiple problems: malnutrition, hypertension, severe depression, anemia. But I knew the real cause of his death was the collapse of everything he had believed in. He died in the public hospital, in a common ward with 5 other patients. My mother, Matthew, Lucy, and I were by his side. His last words were, "Forgive me. I failed you as a father. Forgive me." I was 16 and didn't know how to process my father's death. On one hand, I felt immense sadness because, despite everything, I loved him. On the other hand, I felt anger because his religious fanaticism had destroyed our family. And above all that, I felt relief because his suffering had finally ended. My mother never recovered from my father's death. It was as if she had lost the will to live. She stopped eating regularly, stopped caring for her appearance, stopped talking except when absolutely necessary. She would sit for hours and hours, holding an old photo of my father from when they were young, before they became Jehovah's Witnesses. Matthew, who was then 18, made the decision to emigrate. He had gotten contacts to work in Brazil, at a factory in Sao Paulo. "I can't take it anymore," he told me the night before leaving. "If I stay here, I'm going to end up like Dad. I need to start over somewhere else." He left one March dawn in 1980, carrying just a backpack with clothes and the few dollars he had managed to save. He promised he would write, that he would send money when he could, that someday he would return. He didn't keep any of those promises. I never heard from him again. Hope appeared from time to time at home, but each visit ended in argument. She had gotten involved with older people, lived in tenements downtown, worked at jobs she didn't want to describe in detail. She was 17 but looked 25. Poverty and hard life had aged her prematurely. One day she arrived home with a black eye and marks on her neck. My mother, in one of her rare moments of lucidity, tried to convince her to stay with us. "Daughter, please, come back home. We can start over." Hope looked at her with a mixture of compassion and contempt. "Start over? Mom, there's nothing left to start with. You destroyed everything. There's no going back." She was right, of course, but it hurt to hear her say it. In 1981, my mother died. Officially it was cardiac arrest, but I knew she died of sadness and shame. She passed away on a Sunday morning, while sleeping. I found her when I went to wake her for breakfast. She had an expression of peace on her face that I hadn't seen in years, as if she had finally found the rest she had searched for so long. Lucy and I were left alone. She was 14, I was 18. We didn't have money for the funeral, so my mother was buried in a common grave at Graceland Cemetery. There was no wake, no flowers, no congregation brothers came. It was just Lucy, Hope, who showed up at the last moment, and me, watching them lower the cheapest coffin we could get. Hope left immediately after the burial. "I can't stay," she murmured, and disappeared among the people leaving the cemetery. That was the last time I saw her. Lucy and I managed as we could during the following years. I worked at whatever I could find, loading and unloading at the market, construction, night cleaning at offices. Lucy finished high school with great effort, studying with borrowed books and mended uniform, but she did it. In 1985, when Lucy turned 18, we decided to separate. Not because we didn't love each other, but because we both needed to find our own paths away from the shadow of our destroyed childhood. Lucy went to Denver, where a distant cousin had invited her. She wanted to study nursing and start a new life where nobody knew where she came from. I stayed in Chicago, working during the day and studying at night, trying to recover all those lost years of education. For decades, I didn't talk to anyone about what we had lived through. It was too painful, too complicated to explain. How do you tell someone your parents sold everything waiting for the end of the world? How do you explain that your family was destroyed by a religious prophecy that turned out to be false? I married in 1992 to Rose, a wonderful woman I met at work. I told her our story gradually, over several years. At first she was skeptical, as if she couldn't believe something like that had really happened. But when she met Lucy, who came to visit us from Denver, she understood that every word was true. We had 2 children, Robert Robbie Jr., named after my father, despite everything, and Ellen, after my mother. We raised them in a completely secular home, without religious pressures of any kind. I wanted them to have the freedom to choose their own beliefs when they were older, without anyone imposing absolute truths on them from childhood. Lucy graduated as a nurse and worked for 30 years at Denver General Hospital. She married Dr. James Carter and had 3 children. She built a stable and happy life, but could never completely get rid of the scars from our childhood. She suffers from chronic anxiety and has recurring nightmares about the end of the world. Hope appeared once more in our lives, in 1995. She was 32 and very sick. She had contracted AIDS and had no money for treatment. Lucy and I took turns caring for her during her final months of life. She died at Denver General Hospital, with us holding her hands. Before dying, she asked me to write our story. People need to know what happened, she told me with her voice broken by illness. They need to know how a religion can destroy a family. Maybe this way we can prevent the same thing from happening to others. I promised her I would do it, but it took me almost 30 years to fulfill that promise. In all these years, I have tried to understand what really happened to my parents. Were they stupid people? No, they weren't. My father was a skilled mechanic. My mother was intelligent and had common sense for everything that wasn't religion. Were they bad people? Neither. They loved their children, wanted the best for us, were willing to sacrifice everything for what they believed was right. I think they were victims of their own sincerity. They believed so strongly in what they were taught that they were unable to maintain a critical distance. When someone tells you they have the truth direct from God, and you need to believe in something greater than your own existence, it's easy to surrender not only your faith but also your capacity to reason independently. The Watchtower organization never asked for forgiveness for 1975. It never admitted it had been wrong. It simply adjusted its teachings and moved forward, as if the thousands of families destroyed by that failed prophecy were acceptable collateral damage in the search for spiritual truth. Some of the elders who had most fervently promoted the 1975 date continued being elders after the prophecy failed. Some even rose in the organizational hierarchy. There were no consequences for them. The consequences were only for families like ours. Today, at 62 years old, I look back and see an entire life marked by those few years of religious fanaticism. My father died young and bitter. My mother died of sadness. Matthew disappeared, and I never knew if he managed to find the peace he was looking for. Hope lived a hard life and died young. Lucy and I survived, but we carry scars that will never completely heal. Was so much faith worth it? Was so much sacrifice worth it? I don't know. What I do know is that when I see my grandchildren playing in my backyard, when I see them growing up without fear of the end of the world, without extreme religious pressures, without the burden of having to save all of humanity with their preaching, I feel that at least we have broken the cycle. They will have the freedom we didn't have. They will be able to choose their own paths without anyone promising them paradises that never come. This is my story. The story of a family destroyed by a lying prophecy. The story of an Armageddon that never came, but that ruined our lives waiting for it. I write it because Hope asked me to do it. I write it because I believe people have the right to know how religious organizations can manipulate the sincerity and desperation of common people. I write it because I hope that someday, some father or mother who is thinking of selling everything to wait for the end of the world will read these words and reconsider. The world is not going to end tomorrow, nor next year. And even if it did end, our children deserve to have a childhood, deserve to have dreams, deserve to have the opportunity to build their own futures. They deserve something better than parents who sacrifice them on the altar of prophecies that don't come true. My name is Charles Thompson. This is my true story. And though it hurts to tell it, I tell it so that no one else has to live it.